Chuck Berry and John Lennon played together. Once, what happened next was magical. The story of two legends, one guitar, and a 15-minute jam session that created something so beautiful it changed both their lives forever, even though the world would never get to hear what they made together. It was October 3, 1974, at the Hit Factory recording studio in New York City. John Lennon was in the middle of his lost weekend period, separated from Yoko and struggling with his identity as both a solo artist and former Beatle. He had been drinking heavily and working sporadically on what would become the Walls and Bridges album, but inspiration seemed as distant as his happiness. Chuck Berry, now 48 years old, was in town for a series of concerts at Madison Square Garden. He had been invited to the Hit Factory by a mutual friend who thought that meeting John Lennon might lift the spirits of both musicians, each dealing with their own professional and personal challenges. Chuck Berry arrived at the studio around midnight, carrying his trademark Gibson ES 355 guitar. John Lennon was slumped in a chair in Studio A, staring at a half-empty bottle of brandy and a notebook filled with crossed-out lyrics. The two men had never met in person, despite the Beatles' well-documented debt to Chuck Berry's musical innovations. "You must be John Lennon," Chuck said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had commanded stages for nearly 2 decades. John looked up with bloodshot eyes and managed a weak smile. "And you're Chuck Berry, the man who wrote half the songs the Beatles ever covered." "Only half?" Chuck replied with a slight grin that broke the tension in the room. What happened next was completely spontaneous and would remain one of the most treasured memories of both men's lives. John, despite his condition, gestured toward the piano in the corner of the studio. "Want to play something?" John asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that had become all too familiar during his lost weekend period. Chuck Berry looked at the broken man sitting before him, one of the most famous musicians in the world, yet clearly struggling with demons that fame couldn't fix. Instead of making conversation or offering advice, Chuck did what he always did when words weren't enough. He let his guitar do the talking. Chuck plugged his Gibson into a small amplifier and began playing a slow, bluesy version of Johnny B. Good. But this wasn't the high-energy version that had made him famous. This was Johnny B. Good filtered through 20 years of experience, heartbreak, and wisdom. The notes came out like a conversation, each phrase asking John if he wanted to join in. John Lennon, despite his emotional state, couldn't resist the pull of the music. He moved to the piano and began finding the chord progression, his fingers instinctively harmonizing with Chuck's guitar work. Within minutes, the two men were playing together as if they had been musical partners for years. What started as a simple blues progression evolved into something entirely new. Chuck Berry's guitar work provided the foundation, but John Lennon's piano additions transformed the song into something neither man could have created alone. John's classical training merged seamlessly with Chuck's rock and roll innovations, creating a musical conversation that was both familiar and revolutionary. As they played, something remarkable began to happen. John Lennon, who had been drinking and depressed for weeks, seemed to come alive. His piano playing became more confident, more adventurous. Chuck Berry, impressed by John's musical instincts, began incorporating more complex techniques into his guitar work, showing off skills that he rarely displayed in his regular performances. The jam session continued for nearly 4 hours, with both men completely absorbed in the music they were creating. They moved through various songs, Chuck Berry classics that John reimagined on piano, Beatles songs that Chuck transformed with his guitar mastery, and completely improvised pieces that emerged from their musical dialogue. The most magical moment came around 3 a.m. when they began working on what would become an entirely original composition. Chuck had been playing a melody that had been floating around in his head for months, but had never quite worked as a complete song. John heard the melody and began improvising lyrics over Chuck's guitar work. The song that emerged was unlike anything either man had ever created. It combined Chuck Berry's storytelling ability with John Lennon's introspective poetry, Chuck's rock and roll guitar style with John's sophisticated harmonic sensibilities. The lyrics told the story of two musicians from different generations finding common ground in their love for music, while the melody soared with an emotional intensity that neither man could have achieved alone. They decided to record this spontaneous creation, using the studio's basic equipment to capture what they both recognized as something special. The recording session lasted until dawn, with Chuck and John layering guitars, piano, bass, and even some tentative vocal harmonies over their original improvisation. When they finally stopped playing, both men were emotionally and physically exhausted, but there was something different in the air. John Lennon looked more alive than he had in months, while Chuck Berry seemed rejuvenated by the experience of creating music with someone who truly understood what he was trying to express. That was, John began, searching for words to describe what they had just experienced. Magical, Chuck finished. And both men knew that was exactly the right word. They listened back to the recording they had made, and both were amazed by what they heard. The song they had created was a perfect blend of their individual styles, but it was also something entirely new. It captured the spontaneous joy of musical creation while maintaining the technical sophistication that both men brought to their craft. Chuck Berry looked at John Lennon and saw not the famous Beatle or the troubled celebrity, but a fellow musician who understood that music was about more than fame or commercial success. It was about the magic that happened when creative people connected through their art. John Lennon, for his part, looked at Chuck Berry and understood something that had eluded him during his months of depression and self-doubt. Music wasn't just about personal expression or commercial success. It was about communication, about finding connections with other human beings through shared creativity. The two men made a pact that night. The recording they had made together would remain private, a secret shared between two musicians who had found something special in each other's company. It wasn't about keeping the music from the world out of selfishness, but about preserving the magic of what they had created for themselves. Chuck Berry and John Lennon never played together again, but that single night changed both of their lives in profound ways. John Lennon returned to his work on Walls and Bridges with renewed energy and creativity. The album, released later that year, showed a level of musical adventurousness and emotional depth that many critics attributed to John's renewed sense of purpose. Chuck Berry, meanwhile, seemed to gain a new perspective on his own legacy and influence. His performances throughout the mid-1970s showed an increased willingness to experiment and take musical risks, as if his session with John Lennon had reminded him that his music could continue to evolve and grow. Both men spoke privately about their collaboration to close friends and family, always describing it as one of the most meaningful musical experiences of their careers. Chuck Berry would tell people that playing with John Lennon had reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, while John Lennon described the session as the night I remembered how to be happy while making music. The influence of their collaboration could be heard in both men's subsequent work, though fans and critics were never quite sure what had caused the creative renaissance that both experienced in the mid-1970s. John Lennon's later solo work showed an increased appreciation for rock and roll's roots, while Chuck Berry's performances incorporated more sophisticated harmonic and melodic elements. The secret recording they made that night became something of a legend within the music industry. People who had worked at the Hit Factory that night would occasionally mention the session to other musicians, describing it as one of the most incredible musical events they had ever witnessed. But the recording itself remained locked away, known only to Chuck Berry and John Lennon. Years later, after John Lennon's tragic death in 1980, Chuck Berry would sometimes mention their collaboration in interviews, always with a mixture of joy and sadness. He described it as one of the most important musical experiences of his life, a reminder that music's greatest power lay not in its ability to make people famous or wealthy, but in its capacity to create genuine human connections. Chuck Berry kept his copy of their secret recording until his own death in 2017, occasionally listening to it in private moments when he needed to remember what music could accomplish when two creative spirits truly connected. Close friends and family members reported that he would sometimes smile mysteriously when certain songs came on the radio, as if he were remembering a private joke or a beautiful secret. The magic that Chuck Berry and John Lennon created during their one night together extended far beyond the music they recorded. It demonstrated something that both men carried with them for the rest of their careers, that the most profound musical experiences often happen not in front of audiences or in pursuit of commercial success, but in quiet moments when musicians connect with each other on a purely creative level. Their collaboration also proved that musical greatness transcends generational boundaries. Chuck Berry, the father of rock and roll, and John Lennon, one of rock's most innovative second-generation artists, found common ground in their shared love for music's emotional and creative possibilities. The story of their single night together became a testament to music's power to heal, inspire, and connect. John Lennon emerged from his lost weekend period with renewed purpose and creativity, while Chuck Berry gained a deeper appreciation for his own artistic legacy and continued potential for growth. In the end, the magic that Chuck Berry and John Lennon created together wasn't just about the music they recorded. It was about the reminder that creativity is most powerful when it's shared, that artistic greatness is enhanced, rather than diminished when it connects with other forms of greatness, and that sometimes the most important musical moments happen away from the spotlight, in studios and practice rooms where musicians remember why they fell in love with music in the first place. The secret recording of Chuck Berry and John Lennon playing together remains one of rock and roll's greatest lost treasures, a piece of musical magic that exists only in the memories of two men who understood that some experiences are too precious to share with the world. It stands as a reminder that music's greatest power lies not in its ability to entertain masses, but in its capacity to create moments of genuine human connection and artistic transcendence. Their single night of collaboration proves that when two musical legends come together with open hearts and creative spirits, the result can indeed be magical, not just for the musicians involved, but for anyone who believes in music's power to transform, inspire, and heal. If this incredible story of musical magic and creative connection moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with any musician who needs to remember that music's greatest moments often happen in private, between artists who understand that creativity is most powerful when it's shared. Have you ever experienced a creative collaboration that felt truly magical? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing untold stories about the secret moments that shaped music history.